We're going to talk about the harmony of nature, war, and what it means to be a wise person. Welcome. I'm Simi Lerner, and this is the Judaism From Within podcast, the podcast where we go through the works and the perspective of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. We're going through the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot, and once again, the disclaimer, I'm not going through all of it. I'm going through the ideas that leapt out to me as being interestingly relevant and kind of cool, in the sense that he approaches things from within a system. And that's something I always encourage my students to try and approach Judaism from. You want to look at Judaism as a structure, as a system that you can fit other principles within. Meaning, rather than the contrast of this would be like a Dvar Torah mind, where you've got lots of little snippets, and little snippets sort of come together, but they don't really fit together. So you've got a collection of snippets on Judaism rather than an integrated whole. And a good example of this is the opening of the Perek, which talks about the 10s, talks about the 7s, talks about the 4s. Let's talk about the 10s. 10 things. God created the world in 10 statements. Now, why is this interesting? Now, this is interesting from Rav Hirsch's standpoint, and this brings him back to his work on the 19 letters, where he sort of develops, and I always struggle the best way of phrasing this to people, because I want to say a narrative, a story, a underlying sort of structural way of looking at the world. And it's more than a myth, it's more than a narrative, it's deeper than both of those. He tries to ask us to view the world as if it is blossoming with love. Now, a person's going to say, what are you talking about? I look at the world and I see, a world, it's got stuff going on in it, but what's the relationship to love? Well, from Rav Hirsch's standpoint, based off this idea of the 10 mamoros, rather than if you have the metaphor of 10 marbles being dropped on the floor, right? Dropped on a table. Each of those marbles exist, but they're in parallel to each other. They have no connection with each other. You parallel this with 10 cards or cups. Things resting on that which is below it. That is the structure of reality from Rav Hirsch's standpoint. Everything is built off what came before. Everything is dependent on what came before. But more than that, it also gives to what came before. What do I mean by this? This is an ecosystem, but it's a moral ecosystem. Everything that exists feeds what's above it, but also draws from what's below. We call this the circle of life. This is the world that Rav Hirsch believes was created by God. Thereby you have a world that is constantly giving and receiving. Now a person's going to say, well, the raccoon doesn't decide any of this. Absolutely. It is giving and receiving by its very nature, by its obedience, so to speak, to the Almighty. But that is what it's doing. The world isn't this sort of dead landscape. This world is a vibrant ecosystem of giving. And mankind is at the summit of this. Mankind gives meaning to everything that came before. The classic example that we have from Chazal is the idea that you came at the end. Does that mean that like a banquet was prepared and you arrived to receive the banquet, or you came at the end and the mosquito was created before you? This is trying to give rise to, okay, well, what is your role in this? From Rav Hirsch's understanding, you have the creation of the world, this vibrant, lived expression of love. Mankind is created at the end, as the summit. If mankind does his responsibility, he justifies everything that came before. He justifies everything that comes before and gives meaning to what came before by living out his responsibility and his duty. Rav Hirsch talks to us and asks us to take example from the blade of grass or the peal of thunder. It lives out its duty. True, not by its own will, but that is where mankind comes into play. There is this harmony that we are asked to play within. Yes, we can play the music, and we can give meaning to that which comes before us, and thereby we achieve our role as humanity. Or we can sow discord into the music. We can choose to play a different song, and then we can destroy what came before. That is Rav Hirsch's understanding of these 10 mamoros. If it was just one, then everything would be disconnected. Everything would be, yes, rooted in a source, but it wouldn't be interconnected in a meaningful way. These 10 mamoros are giving rise to that same idea that Rav Hirsch is asking us to view the world through. So we have creation. Next 10 mamoros are the mamoros of the generations, from Adam to Noach and to Avraham. What's these 10 generations? This is a long time. Rav Hirsch looks at this as an expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's next stage, which is justice, which is education. Mankind didn't live up to this expectation, without going into the details, and thereby you had an extended time of education where mankind was coaxed, was educated to try and fit in line with the divine will. But mankind refused, at which point you have Avram. Now we have the 10 tests of Avram. And for Rav Hirsch's understanding of a test, you often have the philosophical question, what is a test? Does God not know? Rav Hirsch's understanding of a test is like what the metaphor that Chazal use of a potter. A potter doesn't hit on the broken pot. No, the potter hits onto the well-made pot, so he can hear the ringing of the quality of the pot that he has made. Same when it comes to the Almighty. The Almighty hits, so to speak, on the pots that are well made. Thereby their ringing out of their quality is a Kiddush Hashem, is a demonstration of this person's commitment and their relationship to God. So you have the 10 statements of creation, you have the 10 statements, let's call it, of education, and the 10 statements of the realization of that education when it came to Avram. But now let us shift, so to speak. Let us shift to the next 10, the 10 of twilight. Now, this is truly a beautiful idea, and I'm not going to go through all these artifacts that Chazal describe as being created during Bein HaShmoshos. What is Bein HaShmoshos? It's between the sundown on Friday and the arrival of Shabbos. It's that sort of like mixed in-between time. It's because Shabbos is a unique day, and during the week is a unique time. You have the 6 days, which represent the creation of the natural world, and the 7th day, which is Shabbos, which gives meaning to that which came before. It was the means to an end. It was the end, which was Shabbos. That's where in our lives we live Shabbos out in a meaningful way over the course of the week, because the week is leading up to Shabbos. But what are these 10 things? There are a lot of them, from the mouth of the pit that swallowed up Kairach, to the well, to the tongs that were the first tongs that were used, which in and of itself is quite cool, because how do you make the first tongs? On some level, they had to be given to us by God. The giving of the law, writing, the shamir worm, and so on and so forth. I'll pick on a couple of them that Rav Hirsch develops. The shamir worm, writing, the moral law of Sinai. What is unique about these things is that they bridge the gap between the spiritual and the physical, not in some sort of mushy sense of the word, but spiritual in terms of moral, the higher meaning that Shabbos represents. 6 days of creation is the physical world. 7th day is that higher goal, that higher meaning that we are striving towards. Those are represented by these objects. These objects sort of are in a liminal space between the physical and the moral. The shamir worm, what's a worm got to do with it? Well, the creation of God's home couldn't be made with brick, with steel, with a sword. It had to be cut in another way. So what is the shamir worm representing? It's representing that the means cannot contradict the ends. The ends, which is the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, can't be contradicted by using a sword in its creation. Thereby the shamir worm represents that building without using the sword. Thereby that moral lesson is embedded in what we mean by the shamir worm. Language, letters, once again, the ability to transmit over generations. It's a physical thing, but it is profoundly spiritual. The giving of the law. Even the tongues, which represent industry for Rav Hirsch, is sort of the divine validation that industry bridges the gap between the physical and the moral. In each one of them, you can, on a pause and reflection, you can see how each one of them bridges this gap. The mazikin, Rav Hirsch is like, we're not quite sure what they mean by that, but there is an aspect of the physical world that forces us to grow through struggle and difficulty. The tests or the difficulties we experience in this world draw out of us a moral light. Thereby you have that bridging when it comes to the mazikin, or the demons as they are known. To move to another direction, we're now going to discuss the 7. And of all these ones that come up, they're all quite beautiful, and Rav Hirsch discusses the nature of property. He has a wail against communism. What a person says is what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, and the different combinations of these. What I want to talk about actually is something a bit more unique, where he discusses the punishments for certain sins. And this really fits into Rav Hirsch's original concept, because when you first hear this idea, you might say, well, this sounds a little bit naturalistic. This sounds a little bit atheistic. But it makes there's such a beautiful sense it makes when taken in connection with the original statement. And I'll explain what I mean. Rav Hirsch describes the different punishments for different sins. For example, exile for not keeping up the Shemitah, war for not giving, famine from not giving tithes, war from delaying in judgments, and so on and so forth. The person can say, what possible relationship is there for me not doing Shemitah and, I don't know, exile? Like, what are the connections here? How do they make any sense? And Rav Hirsch looks at them as being natural outgrowths to your moral inadequacies. And this is giving a naturalistic explanation, but it only has a taste of naturalism if you forget that we're living in a world that is created on the basis of a moral structure. You smack against the world, eventually it will smack back. That's the nature of the world HaKadosh Baruch Hu made. So when you delay in judgment, of course war will manifest. Because what is judgment? What is a court? A court releases the pressure. There's a pressure valve that emerges when individuals are in conflict. What does a court do? A court relieves that pressure. Okay, and what happens if you don't relieve that pressure? What happens if you don't relieve the pressure and you allow people to stew in their injustice? You allow people to stew in their own anger. Well, then you will get war. You will get strife. That is a consequence of your immorality in relationship to the world. Famine and your inconsistencies when it comes to your tithes. Well, if you hoard all the wealth, famine obviously will come about. But even things like such as wild animals, Rav Hirsch describes that what comes about through wild animals, well, the punishment of wild animals, well, breaking your vows. What distinguishes you from an animal? Your ability to keep your word, your ability to use speech, right speech, and be committed to it. Well, let's say that breaks down. What distinguishes you from an animal? To the extent that animals will take over because you will no longer exist as a society. Societies cannot survive on lies. And this is what we call the wisdom of Chazal. Once again, it's an idea that I often come back to. It's when a person says, like, tell me something wise that Chazal say. And people think of Pirkei Avot and they sort of say the statement, but they don't dig into the statement to see, okay, in a way that this would be wise to me, as well as a person who doesn't accept the principles of Judaism, let's say. What about these could I articulate to them and say, this is what my tradition says. This is what my tradition says to the world. And a person can look at that and go like, I mean, I might not agree with your assumptions, but that's pretty deep. So on that note, as always, thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful week.